I don't know how many of you watched the Democratic Convention this past week. I didn't watch it all the way through, but I watched clips and segments of it. I also watched clips and segments of the Republican Convention last month. I've been following what's been happening in the States fairly closely, along with some of the things in our own politics here in Canada. And of course, we've all been following what's been happening in Israel. And one of the things that I think I've spoken about before, I know other rabbis have as well, is the divide that we're seeing. The divisions in our society today and how far the gaps seem to be growing between different political parties, different affiliations. The idea of echo chambers. The way we just listen to others who agree with us. And someone who doesn't have our same ideas, someone who thinks differently, isn't a different opinion we should give value to or listen to, and instead is the enemy. Despite having said this message myself and having listened to other rabbis and leaders I know who've brought this up, the problem seems to just keep growing. Because what I saw in both conventions this year was very little about why we were the best party and why we were the one you should vote for because we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and why this is the way to help fix the brokenness in our world and our society. What I saw from both conventions was just a lot of name-calling, why the other side was the enemy, why they were evil, why they were wicked, why they were bad. A lot of ad hominem attacks. And while I don't think we're still at the same level here in Canada, in a lot of ways, we're moving the same direction. Political discourse here, in just the 7.5 years I've been living in Canada, I've watched it get more and more contentious. I've watched what happened south of the border creep north, and that division and that anger. And we saw that in Israeli society when it came to the protests for and against, or protests against Netanyahu's government and the government's actions back. We saw it, thankfully, the country come together after October 7th. We see the divisions happening still now. And so the question is, where do we go from here? How do we handle someone's opinion when it's different than our own? How do we deal with someone who thinks something the opposite of us? How do we approach it when we have a vision or an idea for what's broken and how it needs to be fixed, and someone else has a different approach to how to fix it? Or maybe even worse, they don't even think that what we see as broken is broken. They think it needs to go more in the other direction. Our parsha this week, I think there's an interesting lesson. We have the famous sin, the sin of the golden calf. But as Moses retells it this week in the book of Devarim, it's not the same way it happened in the book of Shemot. There are some differences. There are some changes in the story and what happened afterwards, and the reason for and the reason God forgave them, and the punishment. And the question is, how can both stories exist? How can there be two versions of this story? The truth is, if you read the Torah critically, many of the stories have a couple of versions. Whenever I meet with a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah family to talk about Parshat Bereshit, to work on the Devar Torah with the students, they're always surprised when I tell them that there are two different accounts of creation. The first and the second chapter. We think of them as two different stories, the story of God creating the world in 7 days and the story of the Garden of Eden, but they're both about the creation of the world. And they happen differently. Things are created in different orders. The question is, how can they both be true? And ultimately, it's a modern problem, I think. It's a modern problem, this idea that we have to be right 100%, and that anyone who has a different truth or a different understanding is entirely wrong. I'm not saying that every opinion needs to be given equal weight and equal value. I'm not saying that I don't think we should strive for truth and that there is a truth out there. But as human beings, we're fallible. And the Torah and the rabbis of old are much more comfortable than we are today with the idea of there being multiple perspectives. One person's account of what happened at the sin of the golden calf and the other aren't in conflict, because the rabbis recognize that they each have a part of the truth in them. And it's only with both of them do we get the fullness of what really happened before, during, and after. Today in our society and in our world, we're so quick to go to name calling, to pointing the finger, giving blame to the other side. And yet our tradition teaches us that actually the way we solve our problems and our differences is by hearing multiple opinions, by listening to the other side. The famous debate between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel in the Talmud. Most of the time, in all but 3 cases, the rabbis side with Hillel. We go with his opinion. And the question is why? Why is Hillel always right? And the answer given for why we go with Hillel is not actually that his opinion was right, but that he always gave the opinion of Shammai first. To get closer to the truth, we need to do a better job of listening to others. Because shouting and arguing isn't getting us there. It's just making the world more divided, more angry, more hurtful, more painful to live in. One of the most common words we see in the book of Devarim is the commandment to listen. Shema. To listen. It's a central Jewish idea. So we prepare ourselves for the Chagim. Just a little over a month. So we prepare ourselves for the new year, 5785, and what we want it to be, who we want to be in this year to come. My suggestion is, if we want a world that's a little less divided, we have to start by listening to others a little bit more. Shabbat Shalom.